In this video, we will be disassembling the Honda GXV530 overhead cam twin cylinder engine. Taking a look at our engine, we want to locate both of the head covers. Directly above the head cover, we want to remove the spark plug boot. And using a 13/16 socket, we can remove the spark plug. And we'll follow the same procedure for the other side. Taking a look at the top of the engine, we want to locate the two thumb screws for our air filter cover. And that air filter cover can then be removed. Followed by our air filter with the protective screen. Taking a look on top of the engine, we have our flywheel screen. This is held on by 4 Phillips head screws. Taking a look at our fan cover, we have 2 10mm nuts and 4 10mm bolts holding that on. Additionally, we have 2 washers. And we have our fuel line that we need to remove from the clip. If we locate our 2 cylinder assemblies and we look between them, we can see our carburetor assembly. Easily accessible from the outside, we have our air cleaner elbow. This is held on by 4 10mm bolts. Now, removal of these 4 bolts will cause a handful of components to come loose, so we need to gently set those down, and we will focus on each of these one at a time. Beginning with our air cleaner elbow, we want to gently work that air line off, and you want to make sure that you do not lose the metal spacers. We had our carburetor insulator come off as well. We have 1 piece of linkage that is connected to our control assembly. This can be worked off. On our carburetor, we have a piece of vinyl hose which can remain attached. We also have a solenoid with a wiring harness. We will need to disconnect this. We have a piece of linkage connected to our carburetor, and we also have a fuel line connected to our carburetor. We want to push on the linkage retainer to slide that linkage out. The fuel line connecting the carburetor to our filter will be disconnected at the filter side. First, removing our retaining clip and then twisting off our fuel line very gently. Located behind where the carburetor was positioned, we have our engine stop diode. This is held on with 1 10mm bolt. And following our first wire, we can disconnect that from the ignition coil. We can then follow our other wire to the other ignition coil. And we can continue to follow those wires around to another wiring harness. And we can then remove that unit. Next, we will identify the intake manifold. This is held on by 4 10mm bolts. And we can work that piece off. Taking a look at the top portion of the engine again, we will locate our 2 ignition coils. These are held on by one 10mm bolt and one 10mm stud bolt. And it is worth noting that the stud bolt is on the left side on each of these. And don't forget to keep track of the spacers that come off with that coil. Turning the engine around, we can then find our voltage regulator rectifier. This is held on by 2 10mm bolts. The bracket and the rectifier will come off as one unit. And we are held on by a connection point on the starter, as well as 2 connection points on our harness. Turning the engine around again, we can see our fuel pump and bracket held on by 2 10mm bolts. We then want to very gently twist and pull on the fuel line. And near that fuel pump location, we have one 10mm bolt for our dipstick tube. And directly below the location that we removed our dipstick, we have a oil sender. This uses a 15/16 socket. Shifting focus back to the top of the engine, we have our flywheel and flywheel nut. This uses a 3/4 inch socket and a strap wrench. To remove the flywheel, we are first going to thread on the flywheel nut halfway. Using a 3-jaw puller, we can set that up on the edge of the flywheel and our flywheel nut. Then applying a little bit of pressure with a socket, we can pop that flywheel off. After that, we can remove our flywheel nut and wiggle off our flywheel. And with that flywheel removed, we can remove our flywheel key. Rotating the engine again, we can locate the starter. And our starter is held on with 2 14mm bolts. As you loosen these, you will want to hold on to the starter so it does not fall. Rotating our engine again, we want to locate both of our valve covers. Each of these valve covers are held on by 4 10mm bolts. Now typically you would have to very carefully pry off this valve cover as there is sealant holding it in place, and the second one as well. Next we are going to set the engine upright, and rotating the crankshaft manually, we will look for our alignment marks that are used in timing of the engine. When these marks are aligned with the mating surface on the valve cover, our piston is at top dead center and we have no spring pressure on our rocker arms. And those rocker arms should have just a little bit of play. And we can remove our rocker arm shafts and rocker arms. Rotating our engine again, we can locate our cam pulley shaft. Our cam pulley shaft can be removed, and we can work that belt around the cam pulley. And that process can be completed with the other side. Taking a look at the perimeter of our cylinder assembly, we have 4 12mm bolts and 1 10mm bolt. These all can be removed next. And on one of those cylinder assemblies, we do have just a little bit of linkage that needs to be disassembled. And using a large standard head screwdriver, we can work that cylinder assembly free. And I can remove that air line to get that out of the way. And this procedure is repeated for the other side, first removing all of our nuts as well as that 10mm bolt. Taking a look at our oil pan assembly, we have 7 12mm bolts. I will be loosening these in a star-shaped pattern to evenly reduce pressure off of this oil pan. We can then remove our belts and our thrust washer. And I'm going to rotate the crankshaft until I can get access to my connecting rod end cap bolts. These are 10mm bolts, and we are only going to remove one end cap at a time because we do not want to mix up the end caps with the wrong connecting rod. We'll wiggle that loose and finish removing that piston. And making sure that my match marks line up, I'm going to reassemble that connecting rod and connecting rod end cap just by hand outside of the engine so that, again, I do not mix up the end cap with the connecting rod on the other side. And we can reassemble that together as well. And after that comes the crankshaft. Additional parts we could take off include the oil filter, the valve breather assembly, and our coil assembly. We can then remove our valve retainers and springs. You will see that we do have a seal on one side, and those valves can then come out. And that concludes the disassembly process. In this video, we will be reassembling the Honda GXV530 overhead cam twin cylinder engine. Before installing the valves, we want to apply just a little bit of oil down the valve guides. Taking a look inside our cylinder assembly, we want to identify our two valve locations. One is clearly larger than the other, so we will want to make sure to install the correct valve in the correct location based off of size. We can then install our springs and retainers. And we'll repeat that process for the other cylinder. And we do want to make sure that those retainers sit inside of the spring. And then we can apply a little bit of oil to the springs, the valve stems, and the retainers, and work that down just a little bit. Beginning with one of our pistons, we are going to orient our piston rings so that the end gap is 120 degrees from each other. Additionally, those piston rings should move freely and should not be seized in place. On the top of the piston, there is a forward indicator. If we turn the piston over and look inside, we also have a forward indicator. And we can apply a little bit of oil to the piston rings and the piston skirt. And next comes our piston ring compressor. And we want to raise the piston out of the compressor just a little bit. And a little bit of oil on the cylinder walls. And we can then insert the piston into the cylinder. And with one motion, we can install the piston. Now, taking a look at our diagram, we want our exhaust side facing to the left and our forward mark facing down on our piston. And we can verify our exhaust side by the exhaust port. And we can then rotate the piston until that forward mark is facing down. And we can repeat that process with the other cylinder. After applying a little bit of oil to the PTO journal on our crankshaft, we can install that crankshaft into the engine. Taking a look inside our engine, we will be starting with the cylinder to the top left of the crankshaft. This piston will sit behind the other piston just a little bit, or rather the connecting rod and connecting rod end cap sits towards the back. And we also want to make note that we do have two alignment pins that will help us seat this cylinder correctly. And after removing the end cap, we can work that into place. And when we install this, we want to make sure that The connecting rod does not collide with the crankshaft, and a little bit of gentle adjustment to get that lined up. And prior to installing the end cap, we do want to pull the piston down a little ways. This will give us better access to the bolts on the end cap, but we also want to oil the crank pin journal as well as the connecting rod and connecting rod end cap. Our match marks are on the back side facing away from you. So when installing the end cap, you should not be able to see the small dot. And with the end cap in place, we can start the end cap bolts by hand. And we should be able to run both of those bolts in all the way by hand. These will then be torqued to 9 foot-pounds. And then you'll want to rotate the crankshaft several times just to make sure nothing is catching or binding. And because everything is looking good on this, I'm going to install my one 10mm bolt to 9 foot-pounds and my 4 flange nuts to 24 foot-pounds. And I can repeat this process with the other side. And this time we should be able to see that match mark facing us. And our end cap bolts can come next. Again, starting them by hand and screwing them in all the way before we torque them down. And rotating that crankshaft a couple more times will verify that we are on the right track. And this can then be followed by our 10mm bolt and our 4 flange nuts. And again, starting all of these by hand first. And as we rotate the crankshaft, we can see both of those match marks lined up. We can then feed our timing belts into our engine and the thrust washer. And we want this oriented so the bend is facing up at us. With the engine upright, we want to install the flywheel key and then the flywheel, making sure to line up the key with our keyway on the flywheel itself. And if we take a look at the flywheel, we have 3 indentations. Those indentations need to line up with the 3 protrusions on the backside of the flywheel cooling fan. And it will only go on one way, so you need to rotate it until it seats fully. Double checking that each of the protrusions are lined up with the recessed areas. Next, our cooling fan plate has 3 notches, and that will connect up with the 3 protrusions on our flywheel fan. And then we can install the flywheel bolt. If we temporarily set our cover over our flywheel fan, we want to make note of the 2 stud bolt locations. These then correlate to our 2 ignition coil bolt locations. These are what we want to use for timing the engine. Taking a look at the flywheel fan, we have a small hole with a mark and the letter T. This is our indicator mark for timing our engine. And our objective is to line up that T mark with the little hole with our stud for our first cylinder. We then want to flip the engine around and install my cam pulley. And to aid in this process, I have both of my belts on the front end or the PTO side of that crankshaft. They are not sitting on the teeth. And I can hold my belt towards the back and slip that cam pulley in, and then the belt over that flange on the cam pulley. So that cam pulley is loose in there. And then I can work that back belt on. And back to my flywheel side, I'm going to verify that my indicator mark on the flywheel fan still lines up with my stud location for my ignition coil. I'm then going to line up my 2 alignment marks on my cam pulley. This is on the same cylinder side as that indicator mark on the flywheel fan. Those marks should be perfectly parallel to the mating surface of the valve cover. And I'm then going to slip on that first belt. Making sure I don't accidentally rotate the cam pulley or the crankshaft. Next, we will line up that indicator mark on our flywheel fan with our post for our ignition coil on our other cylinder. We then want to line up the alignment marks for our second cylinder and slip in that cam pulley shaft. And then we'll rotate the engine a couple times just to verify that these alignment marks do align at the correct positioning. Next, we can install our rocker arms and the rocker arm shafts from the opposite side of the cam pulley. And it might be beneficial to rotate the engine to relieve any pressure from the springs. And we can follow the same procedures for the other side. And then our valve covers. And you will want to verify that the notch in the cam pulley shaft lines up with our tab on our valve cover. And these will be started by hand as well. We can then install the oil pan, making sure to line up our oil tubes as well as our alignment pins. And then those 7 12mm bolts, just hand tight. We will then torque those in sequence. We can see the sequence jumps around just a little bit. We then want to tighten the flywheel to 116 foot-pounds. The starter can then be installed. Located near the oil filter, we have our sensor. We can then install the oil dipstick and shroud. We then have our fuel pump located right nearby. And we can connect up that fuel line. After that comes our voltage regulator rectifier. In getting ready to install the ignition coils, we have a low side and we have a high side. Our low side needs to have our spacers. Additionally, that low side will have our ignition coil that does not have the wiring harness bracket on it. Additionally, the longer stud bolt will go on the short side. And much in the same, we have a longer 10mm bolt that will end up going on our short side with those two risers. And we can set that air gap to 10 thousandths. And again on our other side. Our intake manifold comes next. Followed by the engine stop diode. And we can connect up our coil on both sides. And we can connect up some of those wiring harnesses. We then have our carburetor insulator, and control assembly, as well as the elbow. We can assemble this together as one unit. So once again, the sequence is our elbow, followed by the control assembly, followed by our carburetor, and then our carburetor insulator. And before we install these 4 bolts, we will connect our linkage. And then we can install our air line. And then we do have an additional piece of linkage on the left side of the carburetor. And then on our carburetor assembly, another wiring harness. We have our fuel line for our fuel pump. And then we can install the top. 2 flange nuts on top. Two washers and 2 nuts where the air filter goes. And 2 on the back. After that, our fan shroud with 4 Phillips head screws. Then we have our air filter and cover. And we do have an additional linkage spring. And lastly, our 2 spark plugs. And we don't want to forget about the wiring harness to our starter. And this concludes reassembly of the Honda GXV530 overhead cam twin cylinder engine.